My name's David Cumin, and the first thing that I have to tell you is that Lord Sumption's book is on sale outside. It's $50 and signed. So I've been asked to convey that. We have a wonderful panel with us. Let me not stand in front of everyone. On the far side, Dr. David Bromell, Senior Associate with the Institute of Policy and Governance at Victoria University. We have Mike Grimshaw, who is called an interdisciplinary scholar, but he's actually in sociology at the University of Canterbury, an associate professor, and Professor Elizabeth Rata, just to my right, who is a professor of critical studies in education. Academic freedom, freedom of speech, are issues that have been around for a little while, I think. But our 2023 survey that we did showed some uncomfortable results, to say the least. Only 46% of academics surveyed said that they felt free to question received wisdom. Now, in our legislation, universities should be critics and conscience of society and challenge received wisdom. Yet only 46% of our academics that we surveyed said that they felt free to exercise that right. 31% of professors, people who you would think are more immune to the vagaries of cancel culture, only 31% of them said that they felt free to state controversial or unpopular opinions. That means 2/3 don't. And 59% of the academics felt uncomfortable discussing treaty issues in particular, one of the sacred cows at the moment. To give you a flavour for how bad things are on our campuses in terms of free speech. And the only other statistic that I want to throw out to preface this discussion is an internal University of Auckland survey that was recently put out, where only 15% of the law faculty said that they felt able to respectfully voice views without negative consequences. Good God, indeed. These are disturbing numbers. My question to our panel, and we'll start with Mike Grimshaw, is whether or not this is an aberration, whether or not we think this is a decline or an increase from what it was before. Let's put this into some context. Mike.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I think to understand the history of academic freedom, we've got to go back and think about what are the various cases in this country. And a couple of famous cases were, one was in 1932 to 1934, and it was the case of John Beaglehole, who was a historian and a radical thinker on the left. And there was an attempt to basically limit his academic freedom and the academic freedom of those who agreed with him in the 1930s at University of Auckland, also Dick Unschluss in the philosophy department. And what you've got there is traditionally the academic freedom debate was, is there a place in the universities for those who are on the left of opinion, not for those who are on perhaps the centre-right? So that was a famous case, 1932 to 1934. There was another case in 1950, which came out of the work of Mobley, The Crisis in the Universities, and The Question, a British book that had a big impact globally. And was there a place for the heresy, the heretic in the university, who would be, in this case, a communist? This is the case of the Cold War. And again, the Chancellor Smith of the University of New Zealand at that time said, yes, there is a case, just as long as we don't have too many of them. But again, it was that sense that the case of academic freedom was a case that depends on what is the politics of the day and what is seen as the dominant opinion of the day. And so then I think we've got to put today's debates about academic freedom in that wider context, because otherwise, as I was talking to David and others, the question is that how does the Free Speech Union ensure that it's not just seen as a centre-right organisation? Because if it's seen as a centre-right organisation, then free speech is only then seen as a centre-right argument, where actually free speech should go right across whatever we call the political spectrum. Now, is it a new thing? Well, I did a bit of a search on Papers Past as to the questions of free speech. And I came across this in 1971, which is really interesting. This is academic freedom, the view of US professor. Some of you might know of him, Sidney Hook. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Sidney Hook, famous American philosopher. And he said, visiting in Sydney, that students' attempts to make universities into arenas for social change would mean the end of their own freedom to seek the truth. He said the threat to academic freedom in American universities had come from conservative forces. Now the danger came from intolerant and radical students. So this is 1971. So the debate that we've got at the moment is actually not a new one. It doesn't even go back 20 years. It goes back to the 1970s. Now, in many ways, the beneficiaries of free speech at one time have become the limitators, those who seek to limit free speech today. And I think this is what we've got to see, how we can actually build back that question of free speech in the university to include everybody across wherever they sit. Free speech is a basic right within the university, but I also think the universities don't actually want free speech. I think many people who work in the universities don't want free speech because they're not interested in academic freedom. And I see this in many meetings, I see this in many discussions. People don't want to speak up, A, because they don't think it concerns them, but also they're afraid to speak up in public because they feel they might be limited in their own promotions, they might be limited in funding opportunities, or they will be sidelined within the universities. And I think this is where the universities are very happy to say they're conscience and critic as long as it occurs outside of the universities. And I think there's a lot of lip service paid to free speech, but there's not really an attempt to actually articulate it amongst your colleagues or with your students.
Gosh, there's a lot to unpack there. If I may, a couple of comments. I joined the Free Speech Union from its inception as the Free Speech Coalition at the time in relation to the Auckland Council banning of the two Canadians. And the only reason that I joined, well, the two reasons that I joined, one is because the email asked for money or time and I had no money. And the second reason that I joined is because I made it very explicit that the only reason that I would stay on and the only reason that I would join in the first place is if there was political balance on the council, at least. And so that we couldn't be pigeonholed as some sort of far-right or right-wing only organisation. I'm very proud of the fact that we have people on our council and in the organisation who cover a broad political spectrum. And so I take your point, and I think we should always be cognizant of that more broadly. There's a couple of things that I want to unpack in all of that. The second one is going to be where the pressure is coming from. Students, administrators, funding bodies, and where we see possible solutions. Let's leave that until the end, possibly. Elizabeth and then David, perhaps, I'd like to pick up on the thread that you pulled there, Mike, of the reason for university and shutting down academic freedom being antithetical to the idea of the critic and conscience or finding truth or uncovering new things or exploring frontiers. Whether it's the right or the left at different times, it's somewhat comforting, I think, to know that this is not an extraordinary period of time, and somewhat depressing to know this is not an extraordinary period of time. Elizabeth, David, your thoughts on the reasons for university and how academic freedom is undermining those?
Oh, well, I'd like to... Is this going? Yeah. I'd like to just look at that word university. University is universal, and yet we are living in an age where we see the return of various forms of communitarianism, which are an existential threat to liberalism. And the university, as we know it, is very much part of what liberalism is, that notion of the human being, the universal human being. A lot of my writing has been about, since the 90s, has been about retribalisation in New Zealand as our version of this much wider move back to communitarianism and the subversion of liberalism. And the best way to subvert liberalism is to get into its institutions, because what is liberalism? Liberalism is when the authority is taken from, individuals, monarchs and so on, and is placed within institutions. They could be the institutions of civil society or of the state. And it's the law in those institutions that operates to ensure that that rights are available to everyone. So I think what we're seeing is actually something quite exceptional, and is not just a matter of academic freedom and the universities. I think the universities themselves are, especially in this country, as a result of retribalisation and its mechanisms. Treatyism is the most effective mechanism, but there are also others. I work in the School of Critical Studies and Education, and of course those of you in the know will know that critical studies actually means Marxist critical theory. Well, it's an interesting place to be. But the purpose of critical theory academics is advocacy. It's not inquiry. It's not investigation and examination. It's not the use of objective scientific methods. It is specifically and explicitly advocacy. And I know, because I sit in meetings with colleagues, and some of my colleagues are people who actually signed the petition, calling the Listener 7 racists and so on. So there I am sitting heavily in rooms with these people. And they say, the purpose of education studies in this country is advocacy. And it's advocacy for a particular political project that brings together the various forms of communitarianism. Retribalisation is obviously the one with the New Zealand imprint on it. But another form of communitarianism is classism. Any type of political system where the political category is not the individual. When Lord Sumpton was talking about the decline of individualism, I think he really got it. That's what it is. It's all about the destruction of the individual. And my colleagues say this. They reject the notion that there is such a thing as the individual. And once you destroy the individual, you destroy the notion that an individual can have human rights, that there is a universal human being, and of course the university is the place where universalism is practiced in terms of us wanting to understand ourselves as humans. So I think New Zealand is in absolutely serious trouble. There's something more I want to say, but I'll keep it for later because what I've said is a bit depressing enough. Yeah,
if I could just pop in there though, on a historical model, if we think about liberalism and the university, that was only really effective in that post-war scenario. It was a Cold War project. If you look at the writings on the university, the crisis in the university, Nash was writing about Flexner and co. in the 30s into the 40s and the 50s. They were all saying there's a problem as to what is the university going to be based upon. And I think the Cold War gave the Western university a model of liberalism that it could actually articulate and the notion of the individual, and many of us were beneficiaries of that time. What you've got, and I think you're right, Elizabeth, from the 1990s onwards, you've got that collapse about the meaning and value of, well, what does, in a sense, Western society stand for when the only other value is economics, basically. Or not even economic, it's just monetary value. And so then you've got that collapse of liberalism within the university, and then you've got this return of, I think you're right, neo-tribalism and communitarianism, because the collective is that sense for meaning, that where do you find the meaning outside of this? And this is one of the big questions with New Zealand society. These questions about meaning go back into the 1970s, into the 1960s as well. I mean, Gordon McLaughlin writing on the Passionless People he's writing there in the 1970s about a crisis of meaning and value in New Zealand society. And so I think the universities in that way are a reflection of that lack of the debate about meaning and value and identity, but also, on the one hand, the individual, but also how do we be a 21st century society rather than just going back and being a 20th century society, because we weren't very good at being a 20th century society, and we're certainly not very good at all at being a 21st century society either.
But if I take a step back out of that, what I'm seeing is as Lord Sumpton said, universities should be the guardians of free inquiry, and this debate that is so needed doesn't seem to be happening. I mean, we had the Vice-Chancellor of University of Auckland, where I'm an academic, say 2 years ago that she wanted to organise a symposium to discuss Mātauranga Māori and science and its interplay, and to have the debate. It's been 2 years, and the Vice-Chancellor of Auckland University cannot organise a debate in 2 years. There's something very upsetting about the state of our universities. David?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up the question about what is the point or purpose of a higher education. When I was an undergraduate student at the University of Canterbury in the mid-1970s, studying English and history, one of our set texts was Cardinal Newman's The Idea of a University. And that sparked for me a lifelong questioning about the purpose of a higher education, which I carried into 3 years working in a management role in a polytech and teaching part-time or on a casual basis in 3 of our universities and being cancelled by one of them. But I think we've lost clarity about the purpose of a higher education. And as I've thought about this over the course of my career, what I look for in a university particularly is to deliver high quality research, scholarship, teaching and learning that expand the boundaries of our knowledge and equip us to solve practical and theoretical problems in innovative ways. And my experience of that is that what we learn and what we teach often turns out to be less important than learning how to learn and learning to think critically within an international error-seeking community. And this is especially important at postgraduate level, where we expect to see evidence of some original thought and intellectual independence. So what seems to be being eroded is the point of a higher education isn't to teach or learn what to think, but how to think and how to think better. And we do this on 3 assumptions, all of which are being undermined in our present context. The first is that there is no final truth or settled science. Every theory is subject to falsification, and no idea is beyond criticism. The second assumption is that there is no final authority, and new and better ideas can come from anyone, anywhere, even from people in a funny little island nation at the arse end of the world. And the third assumption is that even when I'm sure I'm right, I may be wrong, and so I test my findings through peer review with suitably qualified colleagues, and I invite them to find the holes in my argument. Now, that approach and those fundamental assumptions of higher education, I think, are being eroded. I've got some ideas about why. You'll have ideas about this as well, but perhaps, David, as you suggested, we can come to that in a little while. Yeah.
Oh, well articulated, David. And I mean, we have about 40 minutes to solve all of the problems that we've just outlined. But I think you're entirely right. And unfortunately, it seems to me that increasingly there is a pursuit of ideology rather than a pursuit of understanding or inquiry or trying to get to the truth, and a lack of humility of those of us involved in the academy to seek the truth rather than push an ideology. But if we do turn for the next 20 minutes or so before we open it up to the floor to where the root of the problems might be and what possible solutions might be, we'll run down in the order in which we're seated. I think we've sketched out there might be some pressure from the students. There's certainly pressure from administrators, pressure from the funding bodies. I mean, it's impossible to get some grants unless you're ideologically aligned with certain views. Are those the biggest drivers? Are there other drivers? And given that we've got half an hour to solve all the problems, what might be some solutions?
Well, two points I want to make, and I've written a little bit, short paragraph about each that I want to say. Just pick up on this, what I mentioned earlier about if the purpose of the university is turned to ideology, particularly promoting advocacy and promoting a communitarian type ideology. Over the 3.5 decades I've been writing about retribalisation, I've learned one really important lesson, and it's about the righteous. So rather than our universities being about reason, it's now really about the promotion of righteousness, that you are an advocate for the right cause. So this is what I've learned about the righteous. They cannot, indeed, they need not listen to reason because they are already right. And their goodness is proof of that. So reason is therefore redundant. And the other point I want to make is about in order to have rational discourse, rational inquiry, you have to have someone who can do it, the thinker. If you completely demolish the individual, then you demolish the idea of the person who can think. What happens when we remove the commitment to propositional knowledge? And that's what's happened with postmodern intellectualism being used as one of the rationales for communitarianism, where, no truth, there are just group ways of knowing and so on. Now, my question is this. I think we've got to continually insist on the rules of rational discourse. But how can we do it when right down at the school level, and we're now getting a whole generation of this type of student going into the universities, students who have no longer encounter propositional knowledge. Now, propositional knowledge is the knowledge of academic subjects. Academic subjects are derived from and are accountable to the disciplines. If you remove academic subjects, which is what has happened in our school curriculum, we now have something called so-called learning areas, and we have culturalist ideology. Some schools have held on to academic subjects, there's no doubt about that, and gosh, I commend them. But I know of many schools where there are no academic subjects taught anymore. Even the term academic subject doesn't appear in the national curriculum. Now, how can you develop the art of propositional thinking if you have no experience with propositional knowledge in the first place? So, it's
The problem's much bigger than we started out thinking about it.
I think it is.
I think there's all of that there. I mean, universities get the success stories of the high school system, and that itself is frightening, because what we are seeing are the ones who have been able to navigate their way through. And Elizabeth's right, there's a crisis in our education system, and it's an education system crisis that goes all the way back down to primary school, probably down to pre-primary as well. But that's a long-standing issue that is just weaving its way through. The other problem is actually coming from within the universities itself. themselves. The Education and Training Act sets up a universal academic freedom across all tertiary institutions in the country. What we're seeing in the universities, they are writing their own academic freedom policies, which then create a difference between the universities. So your academic freedom in Auckland will be different from what my academic freedom will be in Canterbury. I mean, Philip and I were talking about this just at the afternoon tea, where Canterbury has put its own academic freedom policy out there, which is making itself a different type of academic freedom from what would be academic freedom in Auckland or academic freedom in Otago or at Victoria. And that itself is a problem, because that's coming down from managers, and that's about listening to what perhaps the customer wants. And I think one of the reasons we go back to this, David, is in 1989, when they introduced the new model of funding for the universities, David Novitz, the philosopher at Canterbury, was arguing against that change in the universities, because he said it would actually change the whole nature of how universities operated and would also create issues of academic freedom. And I think we're seeing that today, because I think the universities themselves are not that keen on academic freedom, because that's not really part of what their mandate is anymore. They pay lip service to it, and there are, in a sense, the foolish people who argue for academic freedom within the universities, but most actually know that it's not something worth arguing for, because it's actually seen as a dangerous thing to argue for. We're actually training centres rather than actually academic institutions or universities. We're becoming monoversities in many ways, and I think there's an imposition of singular thinking, which is coming down from management, it's coming from students who are coming through the system, but it's also coming from many of our own colleagues, because to argue against academic freedom is good for your own career.
I certainly feel it, and I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because this change in funding model might be a hint at part of potentially a solution, maybe. So perhaps if you could expand on what the difference was and what changed very briefly.
What happened is basically universities became a version of SOEs, educational SOEs, in competition with each other. So then they were in competition for students, they were in competition for funding. Now, that meant that the whole ethos of why things were undertaken started to change. We're really seeing it now kicking in, because that generation who were the transition generation have actually moved out. And so you're getting a body of people in who have known nothing different from what the status quo is, unless they're actually historians. And that is also the problem, because we've got no historical knowledge of what things used to be, how they used to be. That generation have moved out. And so I'm probably the last generation who can remember what life was like in universities before that model, and I'm 56. I mean, I can remember when Fogelberg at Otago started using the term stakeholders. And that stakeholder language is actually against academic freedom and also against the basic ethos of the university. And so when you've got a generational shift, then what is the norm is what that generation sees as the norm, and it's not actually about academic freedom, because academic freedom is a project you've got to be involved in, rather than it's just we assume it's there and it's freedom to do my own thing, but it's also, as long as my own thing is something that I am rewarded for.
Well, there I think we disagree, and I want to bring some disagreement to this panel, if only for the sake of it. But I think that the business model per se of universities doesn't strike me as being an inherent problem. It's the motivations of the business. If the incentives for universities were open inquiry, academic freedom, and they were rewarded or punished on the basis of their record of those, they would be competing to be the most free academics. Universities.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you there, David. I think that's actually what. But
I tried.
Yeah, but I think that's.
But if I can come in,
yeah, go.
I think we have adopted a narrowly market-driven and utilitarian view of tertiary education and training, and I want to put out an idea with some trepidation, because it's probably controversial, that we've lost confidence at the university level in the merits of an elite education. And I don't mean restricting university education to a socially privileged elite. I mean genuine equality of opportunity and selection on merit for a well-funded elite education. The sort of opportunity that I benefited from coming from Hokitika on the west coast as the first in my extended family to ever go to university, and coming out of it without a student loan, having paid minimal fees. That world is very different from what I now see as aggressive marketing between universities, a lowering of admission standards to get bums on seats because of the EFTS funding model, and relying on fees from international students to as a backstop for chronically underfunded budgets. And I would be quite happy to see our universities with smaller enrolments than they have now, but providing a higher quality education for those who can benefit from an elite education, instead of this daft idea that a majority of young people should go to university.
Which is a Tony Blair idea. Yeah. I mean, we have students who can't read. We have to have remedial reading courses.
Yeah.
We have to teach them how to write. And this is one of the big problems, that they are coming in functionally illiterate out of the school system.
Yeah. So I see that as a problem for society as well as universities' education.
Well, they can feel, but they can't read. They say they cannot read an academic article. And that is true.
Let alone a book.
Books are problematic because books require long-term engagement.
I would like to give the worst example I have ever experienced. But first, just to disagree a little bit here, into disagreement mode. I don't think it's about the market model and so on. Yes, of course, that change has affected things, but it's really the culture of the university now is the culture of based on ideological conformity, and that's the real problem. You can't have a university if you can't have open inquiry as its base, and I think that's gone. But I'll give you my example, which gave me a sleepless night. 2 months ago, I was I'm now a tutor. I was tutoring a class of about 20 Stage 1 students who are going to be our teachers. And I was talking about, the 1847 ship coming into Nelson and how an education society was created even before the settlers got off the ship and so on. And I just threw it out and I said, of course, where's Nelson? Just no one in that class knew where the city of Nelson in New Zealand is. Now, I'm not lying. This is so unbelievable. I kept speaking to them. I said, South Island? I gave a few clues, and then I said, shh, close those devices. Stop looking at them. Use your head, piece of paper and a pencil. Go home, look at a map of New Zealand on an actual map, physical thing, and start drawing. Plot where the cities of the country are, the rivers, the mountains. Now, these are Stage 1 teacher training students. No, it was here in Auckland. This happened in Auckland, New Zealand. And I was talking about Nelson, New Zealand.
I think the issue...
the worst example I've ever encountered.
The issue of the quality of students coming into university is certainly frightening, and a lot of attention needs to be given to secondary education, primary education, preschool education generally, I think, not just for academic freedom or universities or degrees, but for our country as a whole. This is a deeply worrying situation that we're in. But I wonder if we bring it back to freedom of speech on universities and academic freedom. Just a quick fire before we open it up to the floor on possible solutions. Give us some hope. Where can we go? How can we stem the tide, per se, even though this may not be the worst moment in our history? What can we do to help shift the culture on campus, to help give the right incentives, despite the students coming through?
I think your suggestion, David, is the right one, that universities have to be rewarded and induced to support proper academic freedom, because otherwise they won't. And I think the culture within the universities is such that those teaching in the universities have an idea that academic freedom is not what actually academic freedom is. Academic freedom is the freedom to pursue your own study, but not actually to have the contestation of ideas. And I think what we've got is a lack of intellectual debate within the university, but a lot of pursuit of academic careerism. And those two things don't have to be opposed. But I think
they should be intertwined.
They should be engaged. But I think then that's the role of the managers within the university. We've seen the role of managerialism, which rewards certain types, and then the capture of managers by certain interest groups, both within and without the university, mean that certain things become, in a sense, the status quo by default. And I think that's what Elizabeth's talking about with the neo-tribalism that we see. Universities have got their own tribes within them, and certain tribes are in the ascendant, but there's the way that universities can punish those who speak out are actually, well, you're not going to be thrown into prison.
No, it's not about that in the tribes. What I would do is I would remove treatyism from the universities immediately, because it's not just the commitment of individuals to communitarianism, to tribalisation, and its indigenisation, parochialism in the university. It's because it is now right within the institution itself. It's in university over guiding statements. It's in every aspect of university policy. For example, if you're doing a course review, you have to say how your course met the requirements of the treaty, and it's in actual practice. So treatyism goes right into the heart of the university at all levels, policy and practice, and it has done for some time. I had an article published about this in 2011 in an anthropological journal, using the University of Auckland as an example. So I would get rid of treatyism at all levels, take it out of all policy and out of the practice requirements. And then those who do agree with treatyism, they can still have those views, fine. But it's when something becomes actually instituted that it is most dangerous.
Yep, I support that. And I don't know what's happening in the North Island universities on this, but there are formal partnerships, so-called, between Ngāi Tahu Iwi and University of Otago and the University of Canterbury. The effect of these is to stifle and suppress critical thinking and debate on matters that are central to our constitution and democratic governance. And why a university thinks, even if there is any validity to the idea of treaty partnership, surely the partnership is between iwi and the Crown, not between iwi and a university. It's a completely mistaken idea, and it is doing a great deal of damage.
I agree. I think there is. I saw this years ago when I was chairing the Human Ethics Committee, and one of the things that was necessary was when there was research involving Maori, that there was Maori consultation. Now that's a basic element, but if you were not Ngāi Tahu, you could not, and you were Maori, you had to undergo consultation, Maori consultation, even if you were Maori. And that was a really problematic thing that we were trying to push back against, and that was before the quakes. And we actually lost some very good researchers from University of Canterbury down to Otago because of that push within the systems itself. And I think this is where the problem of what we're seeing is that wider societal question of how do we live as both a bicultural country and a multicultural country at the same time, because what's happening in the universities is happening right across the public sector.
I'd like to say something there. I don't talk about Māori, non-Māori, anyone else. I talk about tribalists who are both Māori and non-Māori, but are minority. Most people who identify as Māori are committed to democracy. So tribalists are a small group of people, the ones who are now in top positions, the ones who have done well by doing good, those righteous ones I talked about. And so it's not to do with Māori, it's to do with tribalists. And I think of many good examples would be the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Auckland would be a tribalist. The chair of the committee that reviewed PBRF last year, Professor Linda Smith, a tribalist. So it doesn't matter what. If you start talking about people in terms of their ethnic ancestry, you immediately buy into a racialised ideology. It is much more important to talk about people in terms of the political category that they are advocating should be recognised in our institutions. So I would think there is a role
for people for a tribal identity if they wish to have a tribal identity, and I think what we're not actually even talking about tribalism here. We're talking about the question of power, that's really where
I've really got to define what I mean. By tribalist, I mean someone who is committed to the politics of the tribal of the political category of genetic ancestry. So it's a political category. As a human being, as in civil society, identify with who you want to, with whatever group you want to, religious, ethnic, racial, anything. But it's the notion of the political category which is the important one.
But the political category has social categories, and I think this is the important thing about free speech. We can sit here on a free speech panel and maybe disagree on these things, but I think it's how it plays out in the lived politics of an institution, and this is where I think the lived politics of the institution is the preferential treatment or alignment of some groups over others. I mean, at this stage, it's a certain category based on some. In the past, it used to be men used to have actually a preferential position within certain institutions that feminists understandably pushed back against. And so I think what we have to see is all claims of power, or whether it was straight against non-straight. And I think what we're going to see is that pushback against the claims of power of the normative body who assume a righteousness, which I agree, your term, it's that virtue of the right by preferential power, and universities should not be involved in that. But I think we've come to the point because there's no place for the other views to come in and no place for the contestation.
There's a lot more to unpack. I'm sure we could all sit here for a few more days, but we have a limited period of time, and I want to open it up to the floor. Roderick has a microphone at the back first. Madam.
Thank you. I'm new to this free speech business, having just started making donations last year when I realised something was very wrong in society. I was upstairs with the lawyers, and some of that was over my head, and I'm having the same experience down here. But I thank you all for your scholarship, your courage, and your discipline. I could be described, I guess, as a small business person, but I think what I want to share is my experience as a mum, because I've got older children and I had a late baby. Little anecdote, because they say that art channels the contemporary zeitgeist, and I think it's an interesting anecdote, because naturally I supported my older son to attend university. I recall going to the high school and seeing the art folders of all these amazing young people, and I was so proud of all their talent. So he and his peers went on to study fine arts. wow, that was the beginning of the divide, I think. It seemed to take them from being wonderful contributors to life to, I'll give you an example, someone got an A for making a loaf of bread from her vaginal yeast. I don't know.
That's not a free, but that's not a free speech issue. That's an art issue.
Yeah, I know, but you're just So then, fast forward to my youngest son, who's possibly my most intelligent child. 16 years old. I fought so hard to keep him at school naturally, but in the end, I just had to yield, and he's now becoming a carpenter, And so I guess you're wondering where it's all going, but to me the context is decisive. And I think maybe we're heading into a context where much of this will be irrelevant, and it's really what you're going to be able to contribute to life. And I can only encourage my son to be a lifelong learner, and hopefully, sometime in the future he'll want to come and be with people like you and debate these things. But for now, he has to step aside because it's just not a good environment for them.
Roderick, we've got one, and then one at the front and one on the other side. Thank you.
My question sort of follows on from that, and my perspective comes from being a grandfather. So I've got my children are grown, and I've got 3 grandchildren here in Christchurch, aged 10, 7 and 5, and they've got wonderful parents. Their mother is a teacher. They're all very bright. And they're bright enough to go on for a tertiary education. And my role as a grandparent and my wife's role as a grandparent is to encourage them and to support them and input into their lives as best we can. But I don't want to be an ideologue. I don't want to bend them this way or that way. I want them to be critical thinkers. But my concern is already at primary school, there's an ideology creeping into their learning that doesn't come from them. And so that concerns me. And my question is, can you encourage me to send them to university? Because my fear is that, as this woman back here has said, that this will affect their development in negative ways, which I would hate to see. So it's a wonderful opportunity to ask the 3 of you, or 4 of you, who are all academics, what encouragement can you offer me to encourage them to go to your institutions?
The universities are in many ways as good in a lot of areas as they ever have been. But there are certain areas where there are contestations of ideas. But the best students are as good and as open and as questioning for ideas as they can be. What we're seeing is a certain move through in certain areas of a shutdown of ideas, but that's a shutdown of society. But at least in universities, in some areas, you're going to be opened up to that contestation of ideas. I think law is one area. I think law is basically the new BA. I think law is a basic area that I think many students should actually go into, but they should do a contestation of ideas there. If you don't go to university, the big question is, well, what are you going to do if you are smart? And you go to university. I think the big question is, why do you want to go to university? And the university, you find the people who will give you the insights, the possibilities, and the challenges. But it's always been like that in universities. There's been certain teachers in universities who have only ever wanted regurgitation. I say to my students, regurgitation is for Friday night. I want you to push back and have a questioning of opinion. But that's always been the way. And I think it's easy to see it as a horrific place that is an ideological wasteland or imposition, but it's not. Doesn't have to be that way. But make a selective choice and get them to question.
I wouldn't agree with you, actually. I have a number of parents who write to me asking that question, and my honest answer to them is this. make sure that the child studies a subject like history, but check out the lecturers first, have a look at what they're writing. Is it a postmodern take on history? Is the history department filled with ideologues? Our universities are absolutely full of them. Law schools and universities, I would be very wary of law schools because treatyism has taken hold of law more than other faculties. Social sciences, my colleagues are just starting up a Bachelor of Social Justice, a degree in righteousness. I would be very worried if one of my grandchildren enrolled in that. But what we need in this country is really good historians, and we need a lot of them. So I would say to everyone, study history, study really good history, the sort of history you're seeing on websites like History Reclaimed, where the opposition to revisionist history. But I cannot be optimistic in answering your question, I'm sorry.
David? David, do you have anything to add?
In talking to young people, I want to know, what do you want to do? What do you want to make? What do you want to build? And will going to university help you do that? Going to university for its own sake is just going to give you a whopping student loan, probably. So I'm kind of more with Elizabeth on this. Be a little bit sceptical and careful and choose where you go.
It's a funding issue. I mean, a three-year degree will get you basically what UE got you 30 years ago. So be selective, but also look for postgraduate study. But select where you go, but also make sure they read. I mean, the biggest problem is that most students are coming in not reading, and they're not reading when they're there. Reading emancipates you. You can read against the status quo. And this is the problem, that when we've stopped the reading culture in schools, we've actually stopped that argument. The alternative argument is always there in another book. It's always there in another article, if you're prepared to look for it. And I think that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree. We're slightly on the outside of free speech issues, but I think the question is so important that I want to chip in two things. I think you go to university for three reasons. Firstly, I think, as my father gave me the advice, go to university to get a degree that you need: accounting, law, medicine, engineering. Without them, you're not able to be an accountant, a lawyer, an engineer, or a doctor. That's reason number one. Reason number two is the humanities. And to me, the humanities is an opportunity to spend 3 or 4 or more years delving into an amazing world of ideas and expanding horizons and really grappling with some very difficult issues that are important for society. As David said, I think universities should be practical places, so it's not just for the sake of reading. And the third reason is social. It's a wonderful place to regurgitate on a Friday night, if that's your thing, or hang out in the library with like-minded people and find your place in the world as a young person. And those, I think, are the things to keep in mind in going to a university. Unfortunately, some of what is happening on campus is suppressing those reasons for a university, and that's where I think the Free Speech Union has a lot of work to do to try and reverse some of what's been going on. But Elizabeth made an excellent point, and that is that there is so much information now outside of the university that if you want to spend a couple of years expanding your horizons and you can't find a university in New Zealand where there are courses or lecturers that will allow you to do that without constraint, fortunately or unfortunately, there are other options. So those are my 2 cents. I think we've got time for one more question.
Yep, this question about equity. Does equity have a place should it be in universities, this concept of equity? And if it does, what is that place?
I'd just say no. No would be my response.
No one actually knows what equity is. I mean, I teach a 300-level course, where we ask the students, well, how would you describe equity to your friends, to your family? And nobody actually can. It's a concept that is actually very, very difficult to articulate in a way that makes sense. So I think equality is equality is where we are. Equity is a claim that comes in, but I think equity itself is a problematic term that is highly politicised.
In 1976, the then Director General of Education wrote a paper, gave a speech saying, we no longer talk about equality of opportunity, we will now talk about equity, equal outcomes. And that was the big shift to this so-called equity. Now, he didn't know what he meant, but it took hold, and it's part of this ideology, but no one really knows exactly what it means. So, no, I would get rid of it.
And I'd also argue for equality of opportunity, not equality of outcomes, and for selection and appointment on merit.
The door of the back of the room has been opened. I think that's a clear signal that, unfortunately, we've come to the end of the panel. Thank you to our panellists, David, Mike and Elizabeth.